Book of Ezekiel, Part 5. Prophecies against foreign nation. Ezekiel chapter 25 verses 1 to 30. Chapter 32 verses 32. Chapters 25 to 32 form a unit clearly distinct from the chapters before the siege of Jerusalem, that is 3 to 24, and those after the fall of the city, chapters 33 to 39. In some of the most exquisite poetry in the book, Ezekiel describes God's vengeance against a neighboring country that had violated the covenant people. 7 groups of foreign people are singled out for judgment: the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Philistines, the inhabitants of Tyre, the inhabitants of Sidon, and the Egyptians. According to the 6 of the 7 days listed in these chapters, chapter 26 verse 1, chapter 29 verse 1, chapter 30 verse 20, chapter 31 verse 1, chapter 32 verse 1, chapter 32 verse 17, the oracles were delivered within the space of the 3 years between 585 and 588 BCE. There are 7 empires in the Bible: the Egyptian Empire, the Davidic Empire, the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greek, and Romans. A 7th date, that is chapter 29 verse 70, describes a time 15 years later. It is likely that Ezekiel himself is the author of these important oracles against foreign nation. International with national concern occupied the interests of the prophet in these chapters. Ezekiel chapter 25 verses 1 to 7 against Ammon. Ammonites are condemned for having exulted over the fall of Jerusalem, the conquest of the land. The defeat of Ammon at the hands of the people of the East is promised. God will bring destruction of the Ammonites because they have delighted ruin of Israel. They will come to know the Lord in verses 5 and 7 in their own destruction. Ezekiel chapter 25 verses 8 to 11 against Moab. Moab's fate is to be the same as Ammon, and for the same reason. Moab too is learned to that the Lord alone is God in verses 11, that the fate of Judah and Jerusalem does not mean that Israel is like all the nations. The third oracle is Ezekiel chapter 25 verses 12 to 14 against Edom. Judgment is levied against Edom for having taken part destruction of Judah and Jerusalem, apparently by rounding up the fugitives and turning them over to the Babylonians and then infiltrating the land of Judah and claiming ownership, says Obadiah. The fate of Edom is different in that the vengeance of the Lord will be executed by the people of Israel. In chapter 35, it expands the details of the devastation of Edom. The fourth oracle in Ezekiel chapter 25 verses 15 to 17 against the Philistines. This oracle against Philistia is similar to that against Edom. The Philistines also appear to have harassed the fugitive, taken advantage of them their plight. Although there is no indication of the means of God's punishment on Philistia, historically it almost certainly was destroyed at the same time as the campaigns of the Babylonians against Judah and Jerusalem. Then we have the next oracle, that is Ezekiel chapter 26 verses 1 to Ezekiel chapter 28 verses 19 against the city of Tyre, which was a wealthy and rich city. There are three chapters dedicated to this oracles against the famed commercial city of Tyre, the chief city of Phoenicia. The city, located almost an impregnable rock at some distance from the Mediterranean shore, withstood the efforts of Nebuchadnezzar to capture it. In 586 BC, the Babylonians began a 13-year siege which ended inconclusively. Not until the time of Alexander the Great in the 4th century was part of the island itself destroyed. The 4 oracles in 26 1 to 21 are of 2 types. The first 2 units, that is verses 1 to 6 and verses 7 to 40, oracles similar to the against other nations, because I also rejoiced over the fall of Jerusalem. It too will be punished by Nebuchadnezzar. The second unit, that is verses 15 to 18 and verses 19 to 20, are laments over the death of Tyre and its descent into the netherworld. The fall of Tyre will cause all the princes of the sea to gather trembling on the shore, lamenting the death of Tyre and the threat to their own kingdoms. Tyre will be placed in the underworld, there to remain forever. In chapter 27, Ezekiel portrays Tyre as a great ship, beautifully fitted out and proudly sailing the seas. He relates the extraordinary range and the variety of Tyre's trading activities in chapter 27 verses 12 to 25. Then he details the end of its great commercial city as it destroyed by God's east wind, which wrecks Tyre's exquisite ship, which is much to the mourning and the consternation of the people on the shore. That is chapter 27 verses 25 to 36. Chapter 28 is the second oracle of the ruin of Tyre, that is verses 1 to 10, and lamentation of the demise of its king in verses 11 to 19. Tyre is cast down for misusing his divine position, wisdom, and wealth. Ezekiel grants that God created the king even wiser than Daniel when we compare it with chapter 14 verse 14, but declares that his pride is the undoing of the city. God will cause it to die at the hands of the foreigners, verses 9 and 10. The lament in chapter 28 verses 11 to 19, seemingly based on a variant version of the Eden story, is a judgment against the king of Tyre. On the holy mountain of God, verse 14, a city was established which Ezekiel calls Eden, the garden of God, that as Genesis 2 and 3. Then King Saul sinned. The king, the first human being, was created perfect, wise and beautiful, and was clothed and adorned with precious stones. A cherub guarded the king when we compare with Genesis chapter 3 verse 24, who was blameless until he spurned his beauty and wisdom by acts of violence and arrogance. For his sin he was cast out of the mountain city by a guardian cherub and humiliated before the nations. Ezekiel now recasts this own myth to make it portray the eminent ruin of Tyre. The old story probably related to the sin of the first king leading to his expulsion from the mountain city. The mountain thereafter was the dwelling place of El, the high god, and entrance to it was barred to earthly residents. But for Ezekiel, the historic sin of Tyre constituted the real corruption of the city. God executed judgment upon Tyre by stripping away all its treasures won through its maritime trading and humbling the people for their pride and injustice. Ezekiel does not contrast the truth of the myth of Tyre's origin. He states it in order to dramatize the reversal of Tyre's fortunes. Thus, God is in control. You don't have to rejoice in the downfall of creation. But next oracle in Ezekiel chapter 28 verses 20 to 26 against Edom. A brief oracle against Edom verses 20 to 24, the other great city of Phoenicia, and the great general promise of restoration for Israel following God's judgment of the foreign nation in verses 24 to 26 complete the chapter. The composite nature of this section is indicated by 4 recognition formulas in verses 22, 23, 24 and 26. The oracles against Egypt in chapter 29 verses 1 to chapter 32 verses 32 are even longer and richer in mythological imagery than all the oracles against Phoenicia. The pride of Pharaoh, who considered himself a god, constitutes the chief sin of Egypt. Repeatedly, this theme reoccurs in the following 7 sections. And finally, the last oracle is against Egypt, that is Ezekiel chapter 29 verses 1 to 16, Egypt the crocodile, versus Tyre a ship. So in a composite of general brief oracles, that is verses 3 to 6, 6 to 9, 9 to 12 and 13 to 16, dated in January 587 BCE, verse 1, Pharaoh is chastised for thinking himself maker and the master of the Nile. On account of this sin, Egypt will be reduced to the most lowly of all the kingdoms. Pharaoh had a high status in Genesis. Pharaoh rejoiced at the downfall of the people of God. But he sins against God himself. He considers himself God, and he made the Nile. But he will have his punishment. Ezekiel chapter 29 verses 17 to 21, the wages of Nebuchadnezzar, that is paid by God himself. An oracle that is dated in April 571 BCE verses 17. This is the latest dated oracle. Ezekiel refers to the costly siege of Tyre by Nebu and promises that the Babylonian king that he will recoup this spent treasures by the plunder of Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar is named as God's agent, and his wages are listed as the riches of Egypt. Ezekiel chapter 30 verses 1 to 19, the day of the Lord against Egypt. This section, which is only dated undated oracle in the collection against Egypt, is clearly a composite introduction formulas that occur in verses 2, 6, 10 and 13, and recognition formulas occur in verses 8 and 19. It elaborates the theme that the day is coming when the Lord will devastate Egypt and its southern neighbor Ethiopia. Nebu will invade Egypt, verse 10, and God will dry up Nile in verse 12, and these punishments will lead to international recognition of God. Ezekiel is the only book where God uses Nebu to reveal his power. Pharaoh rejoiced over downfall of the people of God. But now in Ezekiel chapter 30 verses 20 to 26, Pharaoh's broken arm. The 4th section against Egypt is dated in April 587 BCE, verse 20, just few months before the fall of Jerusalem. After 3 months earlier, Pharaoh Hophra had come to the aid of Jerusalem, which was under siege by the Babylonians, in Jeremiah chapter 37 verses 5. In this oracle, all hope in Egypt's help is crushed. God declares that the arms of Pharaoh will be irreparably broken in chapter 22, while the arms of the king of Babylon will be strengthened in chapter 24. God will put a sword of destruction in the hand of Nebu, verse 25, and scatter the Egyptians among the nation, verse 26. Thus will be the Egyptians know and recognize God. Ezekiel chapter 31 verses 1 to 18 is the allegory of the Cyprus, that is the rulers of Pharaoh. The 5th section, which is dated in June 587 BCE, verse 1, is a 3-part prophecy addressed to Pharaoh and his retinue in verse 2, a description of a great tree more beautiful than any tree in the garden of God in verse 3 to 9 that opens the poem. Then follows a prose account describing the fall of the great tree on account of its pride in verse 10 to 14 and its consignment to the netherworld in verses 15 to 18. Ezekiel 32 verses 1 to 16 is the dirge or the lament over Pharaoh. Dated in March 585 BCE, this composite section opens with a fragment of a lament in verse 1 to 3 where the destruction of Pharaoh has symbolized as a lion and a sea monster by Egypt. It continues the oracle of judgment verses 3 to 8 against Pharaoh, allegorically portrayed as a sea monster God will catch and throw upon the shore where the beasts of the earth will devour the carcass. Then follows a series of later expansion that abandoned the sea monster imagery completely. The first, a prose interpretation of the grief that the nations will feel seeing God's sword brandish against Egypt, verses 9 to 10, is added. So next, an oracle about Nebu as God's agent bringing a sword of destruction against Egypt, verses 11 to 14 appears. Closing the section is a brief prose subscription, that is verses 15 and 16, which first reiterates the claim that the desolation of Egypt will be means through which the nations will know that the Lord, and then concludes with an instruction to the daughters of the nation to take up the lament over Egypt's demise on the role of women in the mourning in Jeremiah chapter 9 verses 16 to 19. Ezekiel chapter 32 verses 17 to 32 is a dirge or the lament over Egypt. The seventh oracle opens with the date, this most likely in April 586 BCE. The prophet is told to wail in verses 18 over the condemnation of the Egypt to the underworld. It's not prominent in the eyes of the world. So Egypt's comfort will consider the fact that its descent to Sheol has been preceded by that of the other great world powers. Ezekiel's prophecy against Egypt were probably the most important of all the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Ezekiel tried to convince the leaders of Jerusalem the Egyptians' help was a delusion, but his words, like those of Jeremiah, went unheeded. From his group of seven oracles against Egypt, that is chapter 29, verses 1 to chapter 32, verses 32, the entire cycle of oracles against Israel's seven neighbors, that is chapter 25, verses 1 to chapter 32, verses 32, may have grown as Ezekiel and his followers reflected on the worldwide significance God's judgment of the covenant people. For God, judgment, punishment, as well as his revelation comes upon the people.